I have someone here who's a friend of mine for many years. I've always admired and thought highly of, but he's not. He's like me. He's a Puerto Rican gentleman from Bridgeport. I'm assuming he was born in Bridgeport. His name is Max Medina. Welcome, Max, to our show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And for the record, I was born in New York City.
New York City, okay. And we're going to learn about how he found his way to Bridgeport in a second. But the reason why I decided to invite Max and see if he would accept our invitation to join our show was because I find it unusual. I find it interesting how people very often like to categorize folks in very general terms. And I think that's a disservice to any group when you generalize too often. We're all very, very different and offer a lot. And I think God has blessed us all to accomplish anything that we set our sights on. And Max is a gentleman who actually left Bridgeport to go to Harvard and graduated from Harvard University and has since has children who have accomplished. And I thought by meeting him, you might find it interesting what Puerto Ricans provide or offer and what Bridgeporters offer. So it's just an introduction to one of your neighbors, let's put it that way. So Max, tell us about your folks. Let's start with them.
Well, that's the best place to start because I have always said that to my parents go all the credit. In some ways, it's a very classic story. They were born each to large families living on small farms in Puerto Rico. My people come from a town in Puerto Rico called Adjuntas.
Adjuntas?
And they met there, and they came to the States, the mainland, for economic opportunity. My mom and my dad were very different personalities. My mom is still living. My father passed away a few years ago. My father was very heavily involved in politics and in the Puerto Rican independence movement specifically.
In Puerto Rico?
Both in Puerto Rico and here in the mainland.
No kidding.
In fact, years and years later, we actually obtained his FBI file because he and his friends were under FBI surveillance in New York as they went about their activities on behalf of the cause. And it gave us a few laughs because I would look at a page and an FBI agent would be writing up that he was sitting outside someplace in the Lower East Side of New York where the subjects, including my father, were inside. So I said, "Pop, what were you guys doing in there?" And he looked at the paper and goes, "We were probably playing cards."
Right.
And the FBI is outside thinking that they're plotting something major.
In Puerto Rico, did he have a chance to be involved with the likes of Pedro Albizu Campos and others?
Yeah, those were his heroes, and he was very involved in the independence movement and, paid a price there. And when they came here, my mom was much more grounded. She had nothing against politics, but she also reminded my father that, had to pay bills, had to go to work. So there came a point in time where I think he had to basically put his political aspirations and ambitions aside and become a devoted, breadwinner, head of the family. So they both worked in Bridgeport factories. And after being born in New York City in the great Bellevue Hospital, we came here very young in my life and very early in my life, rather. And except for being away for college and law school, I've been a Bridgeporter ever since.
And I'm fascinated by your father's story. I'm sorry to keep going back before we get to you, but...
No, that's fine. He was a great guy. He was
tell
amazing.
me about, in Puerto Rico, when you're a part of a movement like that, it doesn't mean you drop everything else. Don't you still have to work and have a job and do other things as well?
Well, I'm sure that when he was doing it as a student, he would be doing it when he wasn't in school. I mean, my father was a very intellectual...
Was he a college student?
No, this is high school. Neither one of my parents ever had the opportunity to go to college because they had to work on their family farms and had to help the family exist. My father would have been an amazing college student, as would have my mom, but they just never had those opportunities. I remember that growing up in Bridgeport, we lived in Pequannock Apartments on Broad Street, Building 1. And I used to joke that I was pretty sure that we were the only family in Pequannock that had its own copy of the Warren Commission report on the Kennedy assassination because my father loved reading and devouring everything about politics.
Is that right?
And he was my first teacher when it came to politics. And he was always into current events and he knew his history. So he was always showing us how what we were seeing developing around us in that particular moment had echoes from the past because so much of history repeats itself.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
There were 5 of us. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and I'm the oldest of the 5.
Okay. And with that sibling position came responsibilities?
Yes. These were the responsibilities and also prerogatives. I mean, my sisters will tell you that as a firstborn male, I took advantage of that position plenty of times back in the days. I'm 60 years old, so we're talking about growing up in the 60s. But it came with responsibilities. My mom will tell you that, when she and I would go out with the little ones in tow and she had to go into a store or into an apartment to apply for an apartment, I'm the one outside watching my younger siblings. So it carried a lot of responsibility, but we were always a very close-knit family, and my brothers and sisters were all great kids, so it wasn't hard to do, but it was something I took seriously because there were times when we would be alone in the apartment because back in those days, my father worked for Carpenter Steel, and they had rotating shifts. So there were times when he would be working the 11 to 7 shift, and we'd be alone with my mom in the apartment. So I would stay up with her and keep her company so she wouldn't be afraid and things like that.
So what was his job at Carpenter Steel?
He worked in a few different departments. He was a blue-collar guy who was a proud member of the United States Steel Workers of America. He ended up working there for about 35 years. The last decade or more, he was in the shipping department, and he ran a crew. And it was their responsibility to take the finished steel products and safely get them loaded on these very large trucks that would ship them all over the country. And it was a responsibility he took very seriously because if the load wasn't set up just right, the trucker could be in trouble on the road. And he was always using whatever he was doing as a way of teaching lessons in life. For years and years, he never wanted me to get a part-time job or any job in the factory because they made good money. And he wanted me to be focused on getting to college and not just having a factory job as he had to do.
I'm always interested in history, and so I'm going to keep taking you back even though we're moving forward. What brought your father and your mother to Bridgeport?
Jobs. I mean, back then, Bridgeport was one of the industrial capitals of America. I mean, the local radio station, I'm told, has call letters of ICC because it was the industrial capital of Connecticut. It's one of those places that helped America win World War II with all of the factories that were here. My father told me that back in those days, the only people who were unemployed were the ones who wanted to be unemployed. Because if you got fired from a factory in any given day, you could just walk to a different neighborhood in the same city and get hired that very same day.
People under 30 may not know what Pequannock Apartments was or what it meant in Bridgeport. How do you describe and how long did you live there?
It was a public housing project. It was fairly large. It was 8 stories high. It was located in the South End, right across the street from where the Bluefish Stadium was ultimately built. I remember to this day, I lived at 615 Broad Street, apartment 515. And it was a place where working class and poor folks lived. I can, some things stick in your head for whatever reason. I remember how nervous and worried my mother and father were, and could hear them huddled in their bedroom talking the year that the monthly rent for the apartment first hit $100 per month. That was a lot of money back then. In the beginning, Pequannock had a fairly good mix of all different sorts of people. I remember my earliest memories were in '63 when President Kennedy was killed. We didn't have a television in our own apartment, so we watched it next door. And it was an Italian family, a white Italian family. They had a television set. And there was a black family on our other side. Gradually, as the years went by, that diversity disappeared, and it became purely an apartment project for black and Puerto Ricans. And back then, the Latino population in Bridgeport was pretty much a Puerto Rican population. Today, we have folks from everywhere, Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, every country in South and Central America. But back in those days, if you were speaking Spanish in Bridgeport, you were probably a Puerto Rican.
And what do you recall, or what can you share with the audience, a story about those younger days? Anything that may have happened, or someone who you may have known, or something that your parents may have told you. Give us a little tidbit.
Well, quite a few. One story that sticks in my mind had nothing to do with my family, but it kind of, for me, symbolized the waste of great potential. I was a basketball player growing up, spent too many hours playing basketball, especially for somebody my height. It was never going to be a career choice. But there were tremendous athletes and tremendous basketball players. And I remember watching this guy play ball, clearly playing while high. And even though he was under the influence of drugs, he was handling the ball like an Earl Monroe. And this is the guy that had NBA level talent. And he ended up being a high school star in Bridgeport, but never getting past that. And unfortunately, years and years later, he ended up dying as a result of being shot while attempting to rob a store in Bridgeport. But I can recall the amazing talent that he displayed and the loss of life at a young age. And so stories like that remind me of the lost potential. On the other hand, I remember so many families who were, solid American families whose parents were working hard in Bridgeport, sometimes at a factory, sometimes not, trying to pursue the American dream. So, all the names of all my neighbors are still in my head because it was the kind of place where you knew who lived in the apartments next to you. You knew whose fathers worked where. And it was a close-knit community. Now, when drugs started ravaging poor communities in Bridgeport, like elsewhere in the United States, that fabric that held those families together in a healthy way started to really get shredded.
What was it that your parents taught you or shared with you that had an impact on your decision to be a good student? And what grammar school did you go to?
I went to Roosevelt School, went to kindergarten at the old Roosevelt School, and that got knocked down, and then we transferred over to what we call the new Roosevelt School in '64, and attended that school midway through 8th grade before my folks finally moved out of Pequannock because it had gotten so dangerous that my father said, if we don't get out of here, I'm going to get into trouble. I'm going to kill somebody because the abuses that were going on were quite ugly. So we left Roosevelt, and I ended up going to Central instead of Bassick. But from the very beginning, my parents said education was the way that people like us got to new places. And my mother was my first teacher. She's always been a very, very proud woman. She decided in her head that her kids weren't going to show up at school not knowing their numbers, their colors, their shapes. So she taught us at home before we went to school, which meant that when I went to Roosevelt for kindergarten, I already knew what they were teaching. And they offered to skip me into first grade because my mother had done too good of a job. And my mother said, no, he's short for kindergarten. He'll be really short in first grade, so leave him in kindergarten. But I'll tell you another story. My mother would take me to school. She would go with me on the first day of school. And she would say, let's go meet your teacher. And she would stand right in front of the teacher, and she would have me stand between her and the teacher. And she would say, Ms. Rayford, this is my son, Max. You have my permission to do anything you need to do to get him to learn. And it was her way of telling the teacher, if there's ever a problem between you and my son, I'm going to be on your side. He's going to be a good student, and he's going to listen to you. And she followed that attitude all the way through with all 5 of us. I remember there were times when the school would actually have meetings of parents in the projects. You know, this was a very idealistic age, and in the 60s, I remember there being a lot of young, white, male and female teachers at Roosevelt School who were very excited about teaching in the Bridgeport public school system, very dedicated, and I can remember their names to this day. And the principal was a woman named Mary Ann Lampel. She was about 4 feet, 10 inches tall, and she wanted to reach the families of these kids who were coming to her school. So Mrs. Lampel would come to the Pequannock Apartments and meet with parents in my mom's living room to get them to know what she expected from her kids.
Wow, and this is the principal, not your teacher.
This is the principal of the building.
Wow.
And I thought that was fantastic. And it showed tremendous respect for the community. And the community responded by saying, we've got your back. We're going to make sure that our kids behave. And frankly, I think that's a model that school systems should be following today. I think we should spend, and this takes time and it takes money and it takes a dedicated teaching class, but we should be cementing those connections between the educators and the family support networks wherever they live. You know, back then it was easier because we had quite a few more projects in Bridgeport. You know, back then we had Pequannock, we had Marina Village, we had Marina Apartment. Those are 3 huge projects, all of which have been taken out of the South End. So the South End has a fraction of the population it once did. But one of the benefits of that, and there were detriments obviously, but one of the benefits was whether you were a politician or an educator, right, there were a lot of people.
You could hit at one time.
Very small space. You can hit them all at once.
Yeah. So what happened at Central for you?
Well, Central was a lot of fun. I mean, I had to make new friends. I finished up 8th grade at Blackham School, went on to Central, and I got very involved. You know, I kind of followed my father's lead and got involved in different activities. Freshman year, I made the freshman basketball team, which was like the peak of my athletic career. Never made it past that, got cut from JV. But junior and senior year, I was class president, involved in student council, things like that. So I did extracurricular activities that I think helped me when it came time to apply for college. And Central was a wonderful place because, excuse me, they had a guidance counselor named Richard Shepard.
This is around Bucky Walden days, right? 1975, around there, 74, 76?
Yep. Yeah, Bucky was a year ahead of me. Bucky, I think, was class of 75. And I was class of 76. And there was this guidance counselor named Richard Shepard, who was a real personality. If you got a pass to...
Oh, I remember him.
To get out of class.
He was a great guidance counselor.
He was a great guy. He was a real intellectual. Had the biggest hang-up on Sophia Loren in the world. You'd spend time in his room, and all he wanted to do is talk about Sophia Loren movies. But when it came time for senior year, no one in my family had gone to college. No one in my immediate family. I had a couple of cousins in Puerto Rico who had gone to college, but I had no experience and no ideas. And it was Mr. Shepard who said, "You're setting your sights too low. You should be applying to Harvard and Yale." So I did, and he helped me do that. And
really?
So it was another example. I mean, that's, years and years later, I served 16 years on the Bridgeport Board of Education, and I devoted many thousands of hours to that effort, and I tried to do it to the best of my ability. But
what I'm hearing, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Max, but what I'm hearing is there are always people who are part of your life who want to make sure that you progress. And you talked about your principal, you talked about your parents, you talked about Richard Shepard, who was legendary and ended up spending decades at Central High School helping many children. I remember doing a profile on him many years back. So these folks help your parents in some way, right?
Absolutely. And what I tell young people is you've got to make a good impression. When you land at a school, show the adults there that you are serious about your studies and you're serious about your future. They'll become more invested in you. If you land in a building and you start acting like a knucklehead and you're bopping around with all the other knuckleheads, I'm not saying that it's right that they write you off, but they may write you off. They may say, well, this kid's not interested in doing anything. So since there are finite resources and it's tough to reach everybody, I tell young people, demonstrate to the adults around you that you are going places and you are deserving of their help. And then I tell educators that, my God, you have no idea how you can change an entire family's trajectory by helping the right kid at the right time. And it really is, in my opinion, the magic bullet. Education is the key to all of these problems.
So you listened to Mr. Shepard, and he helped you. You were a good student, obviously, and you applied to Harvard, Yale, and maybe other schools. Tell us what your thoughts were when you were going through that process.
You know, I'd say, blissfully ignorant of what the odds were. I think if I had known then how small the odds were, I might not have even tried, but I gave it a shot, and I was blessed with good fortune, and Harvard and Yale and Wesleyan all offered me admission, and I ended up picking Harvard and never regretting it, and it was an amazing 4 years, but it was a learning experience in more ways than one.
I bet you your hard work is what got you in, but may I ask, do you believe that being Puerto Rican was helpful or not helpful?
Oh, I'm sure it factored in. I mean, I was a Puerto Rican kid coming from a large public high school in Connecticut's poorest city, and my guess is that Harvard had not landed a great many students from Central High School in Bridgeport in previous years. So I think that fact, whether you want to call it affirmative action or diversity or whatever phrase you want to use, definitely factored in my favor.
Yeah, that's good. That's open-mindedness. Did you know, and I'm going to guess you didn't, but maybe you did you know you were going to the same school that the gentleman who your father admired went to, Pedro Albizu Campos?
My father educated me on that. Everyone knows the Harvard name. You know, in today's terminology, it's got a brand that is world-renowned. So I wasn't clued in on all the details, but certainly learned more after I got there. And ironically enough, I remember that the very first class I ever attended was a humanities course in Spanish literature. So after all these years, a Puerto Rican kid landed in Bridgeport and then landed in Harvard. In my first class, the professor's speaking Spanish.
Wow, that's something. Now, do you remember what that was like to get in a car or a train and head up to Cambridge? What's that like?
I'll tell you that there were a couple of cars of Puerto Ricans trying to find Cambridge, and we ended up in Springfield. So first we got lost. Because, you know, back then...
That's a long way lost.
Yeah, we went way off base. Because back then, growing up, if you were growing up in Bridgeport...
There was no GPS either.
No, right? No GPS. And you were poor. Your world was small. You know, we walked. We took the bus sometimes. For years, my family didn't even have a car. So, you know, the north end of Bridgeport to me was like New Hampshire because they had trees instead of concrete.
Right.
So I remember going up to Harvard. I remember, again, first in the family, became a big event, 2 cars of Puerto Ricans, and first time living away from home, so there were tears all around. It was scary, and it was exciting. And then it also became, you know, weird in a way, because all of a sudden, you know, my first roommate was this white kid from St. Louis. Next door, there was There were kids from New York and North Carolina across the hall. There were a couple of kids from California. So Harvard gave me an opportunity to meet kids from different parts of the country and different parts of the world, and that was a wonderful experience.
Was it an easy transition, or was it somewhat difficult for a somewhat sheltered young man from Bridgeport? I'm not suggesting anything by saying sheltered, but you said it yourself. That is, we don't move far from our neighborhoods. So how was that transition?
It took some work, and also, again, I don't want to overplay this because everybody.
Most people who go to college have to go through this.
Yeah, a lot of people had this experience, but I also had to work to pay the bills because even though it wasn't as expensive then as it is now, it was always the most expensive school around. And, my family could afford to support me to a certain amount, and then I had to borrow money, take out student loans, and then continue working. So I remember throughout my entire 4 years at Harvard, I would work 1, 2, 3 jobs simultaneously. And the first job I ever did was dorm crew. You showed up a week early to learn how to do it and to work a full week. So I tell people I spent my entire freshman year and big chunks of my 4 years literally cleaning my fellow students' bathrooms, cleaning their toilets, cleaning their tubs. And I was happy to do the work. Every once in a while, someone has made the mistake of asking me whether I was embarrassed or ashamed, and I get insulted by that question because it was good, hard work. I was proud to have it, and it helped pay the bills. But it gave me a college experience that was very different than my high school experience. In my high school experience, my high school years, I was involved in all different activities. In college, if I was not in class, I was working at one of my jobs, and that was it. So I didn't really get involved in a lot of extracurricular activities during my college years.
What would you say about your decision-making process in terms of the career that you chose?
Well, my mother will tell you that I told her that I was going to become a lawyer when I was 5 years old, and I never really changed my mind. So I think I may be a little narrow-minded in that sense, or lacking in creativity. But I did make up my mind very early on that I wanted to be a lawyer.
Why? Why a lawyer? Why not a doctor? Why not an architect?
Well, some of those other professions involve math, not my strong suit. Okay. I needed to make a living while staying away from math and science. And I didn't mind talking, and I loved to read. So it seemed like law school would be a good fit. So and in addition to that, you watch the television shows, and my father would also tell me about the lawyers that he would know and would work with, and it felt like it was a profession that would allow you an opportunity to work with people, perhaps help people. And so I made up my mind fairly early on and stuck with it.
What was your favorite lawyer show? Did you ever watch those black and white lawyers?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, Jesus, Perry Mason.
Perry Mason.
Yeah. Perry Mason was the big one back in the day. So I did my 4 years of college, and then I had this wonderful girlfriend from Central High School.
Before you go there, and I want to go there, tell me about those 4 years of college. How difficult was that for you?
It was tough. And I had to learn to juggle my work responsibilities, my classroom responsibilities, and it was also an interesting experience because there were times when I found myself in settings where I was with people who grew up in a very different way, either because they had a lot more money or because they grew up in a foreign country, and so we had to learn to understand each other. It was interesting. Some of the things that you saw back in Bridgeport, you also saw in Cambridge. Hopefully it's still not this way today, but I remember if you walked into the freshman union where the freshmen at Harvard would eat, you would see black students sharing 2 or 3 tables together and not many white students eating with them. And then white students eating where there weren't too many black faces at their tables.
Did you find segregation fascinating? Because a little older than you, a couple of years, but I went away to college too, and I remember you either hung out with the black or you hung out with the white,
Right.
but you didn't hang out with like being Puerto Rican from Bridgeport. I didn't know any difference. I listened to Santana, Sly, or Led Zeppelin. It didn't matter to me. What was your experience like?
I think similar to yours. You could see those patterns developing, people kind of self-selecting into their own corners of the world. For me, it became less relevant for my own individual life because those types of patterns would usually pop up most frequently in your social activities. You know, if you went to a school where they had frats or sororities and you pledged one that featured predominantly one race versus the others or other social settings. Since I wasn't tuned in to any of the social activities, I wasn't self-selecting myself into one group or out of another group. But you could see it. And, it's never healthy. It inspires kind of a little us versus them mentality, which is not to say that there isn't a place for ethnic awareness and for cultural activities. It just would be nice if the participation could be diverse. There's no reason why a Caucasian student shouldn't be as welcomed in a Latino organization that would allow him to learn more about the Latino culture.
Right. Now, you were about to say, before I interrupted you, about Central High School or young lady?
Transition to law school. Nancy, my wife, and I have been married since 1981, but we got out of college in 80, so we came back to Bridgeport, and I worked for a year at Carpenter Steel, saved money, got married, and then went to New York for law school.
Oh, you did?
New York
NYU?
University, NYU.
Okay.
And she and I started dating in high school, so we've been together since 1976.
Wow. And your vision of the reason why you chose law and what you thought you could do with that?
Some of it has turned out to be, has come true for me. I mean, I'm proud to have been a part of this firm in Bridgeport called Zelda Sneed & Cooper. And today I'm the managing partner. It's the only law firm I've ever worked for. I joined them right after law school. And they've always been supportive of my activities. So you and I have been bumping into each other in different community organizations in Bridgeport for decades now. I remember being a board member of Nuestra Casa del Pueblo. I remember being involved with Aspira, being a Bridgeport Board of Ed member. So being in the law has allowed me the flexibility to make contributions to those organizations and to sometimes make contributions based on, my knowledge of the law. Today, I'm proud to be a member of the BCYL board. And within my practice, I've done a lot of pro bono work over the years in the bankruptcy court, helping people navigate that system when they've got no other way to deal with their situation and to look for a fresh start. I've also done quite a bit of foreclosure defense work where I tried to help people hold on to their homes when they're under financial pressure. So the idea that I had as a young man of hopefully someday using my profession to help people has come true. Obviously, when you're running a law firm and supporting a family, you also have to focus on activities that will help you pay the bills. So I'm not going to say that my entire practice is devoted to that kind of work, but it's been a substantial percentage of it.
And tell us about your experiences in Bridgeport in terms of your involvements to advocate, to change, to politically accomplish. What are the challenges of this city?
I love Bridgeport.
And you ran for mayor.
I did. I did 16 years on the Board of Ed, and in 2003, while I was still on the Board of Ed, I decided to run for mayor as a Democrat. And that was the year when we had a 6-person primary immediately following Mayor Ganem's departure from office. And John Fabrizi had finished the term, and he was running for a full term in his own right. And we had 6 candidates, John Fabrizi and Chris Caruso and Bob Keeley and myself, a couple of other folks. And I remember coming in third, a strong third, and I gave it a good effort. Never ran for mayor again. But I've always been involved in the community. And frankly, I think that lack of effective leadership has probably been the single biggest reason why Bridgeport has never been able to take advantage of its natural advantages, and why so much economic development has either jumped over or diverted itself around Bridgeport and flowed to other communities around us.
Right. And but I take it your advice to others is not to avoid it, but to continue along that path.
You know, you can't quit and run away, because then it doesn't get any better. I mean, to this day, my wife and I live in Bridgeport. We raised our 4 kids here.
Tell me about your 4 kids.
Oh, they're,
if you don't mind.
No, I'm a proud father, now a grandfather. My wife and I were blessed with 4 children, a son who was born first, and then 3 daughters. And they all went to High Horizons here in Bridgeport. Then they all went to Central High School.
So they're all public school kids.
Public school kids. And, you sit them down before freshman year and you say to them, look, you're going to a big building. Central is big, and it's got a lot of, in their case, it was Central. But the same would be true if it was Bassick or Harding. You sit your kids down and say, look, you know what it's like. You're going to be mixed in with a lot of different kids, and some of them are troublemakers. You avoid them. You learn to walk away from trouble, not towards it. And I told them what my parents told them. Work hard. Demonstrate to the teachers that you're serious about your future. They'll work with you. I mean, I've always believed that Bridgeport has had outstanding educators.
So you passed along what you got from your father to your kids.
Absolutely. What my mother and father told us. What my mother and father told us back in 58, 59, 60, 61 was just as relevant in 98, 99, and 2000. And, Max, our son, ended up going to NYU. Our 3 daughters ended up going to Harvard.
You have 3 daughters that went to your alma mater. How proud are you?
That was pretty amazing.
So we have 4 Harvard students from Bridgeport from one family.
Yes,
and one NYU, which is nothing to shake a stick at.
I'm an NYU man too. NYU is one of the finest universities in the world. And my brother David went to Harvard. My brother Gilbert went to Yale.
That's unbelievable. When I was talking to Elias about this story, I told him, I says, listen, I want to interview Max because I want to know what's in the water. And I think you shared with us what was in the water. But I still think it's fascinating and fabulous and fantastic. And I'm so proud of what you and your family have accomplished, especially since you care about this town and you want to continue making it a better place. But you don't have to be the exception.
No. And in fact, I'll tell you a little tidbit. My daughter, Alexis, graduated from Central. Let's see, in 2009, she graduated from college in 2013, I believe. In her graduating class from Central High School, there was a group of like 6 young women. They happened to all be females. 3 or 4 of them got into Yale. Alexis ended up going to Harvard. A couple went to UConn. Today, 10 years later, she has a classmate who was a young Portuguese woman who had to learn English when she got here, and she now is a very successful business person in New York. She had an African-American classmate who went on to UConn and then medical school. And
so what you're saying to me with all this is that there's more people than we know that
Absolutely.
have succeeded, but maybe I don't know as much about them because many of them have left.
Well, that's the sad part, because so many of our young people that do excel realize that if they want to pursue a certain type of work or success, they can't really come back to Bridgeport. Part of that is natural, but it's also a reflection of the lack of opportunities and excitement for young people in Bridgeport.
Elias, how do you respond to that? He's talking about young people leaving Bridgeport. You're a young man who has recently graduated. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, my thoughts are, people young kids.
Elias Rosario's our engineer and producer.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Sorry, Elias.
That's fine. A lot of people are doing the entrepreneurial route right now, trying to find niches. Some people do things on YouTube. Other people are starting businesses. But yeah, generally that's the feeling among my community, is that we all need to move out. And if you're from Bridgeport, that's how it is. It's like, oh, I can't wait to get out of Bridgeport. But there's still opportunity here, as Max was talking about, earlier, and back in the day, there were nothing but opportunities here, as far as jobs are concerned. But then we're talking about the future, and a lot of people don't want new businesses coming here, but they should want new businesses coming here, because if those businesses were here, then yeah, we'd have opportunities here.
Hey, from all this conversation, does anything come to mind in terms of thoughts that you have?
Oh yeah, Pequannock. It's funny, we talk about Pequannock, the apartments in front of the stadium, right? I went to preschool there, the Head Start program.
Oh, yeah?
95, 96, around those areas.
Just before they knocked it down?
Just before they knocked it down. Yeah, I remember being in the basement of the preschool. I actually have the picture of me graduating from the Head Start program there on my refrigerator.
I love Pequannock. It was a great place, and I remember my father was involved in the Tenants Association, and I remember in the summertime going to Roosevelt for a summer camp sponsored by ABCD and Charlie Tisdale. There have always been people in Bridgeport looking out for the next generation, and Frank is too modest to say, but he's one of those people. I mean, the number of hours that he devotes to pro bono work and to board involvement, especially with BCYL, he is helping thousands of young people hopefully find their path in a healthy, productive direction, because, the babies that are born to Bridgeport families are born with every bit as much potential as the babies that are born to Westport or Greenwich families.
Yeah, that's true.
It's what comes after that changes everything. So,
but there is a difference, isn't there, Max, when a child is born in Bridgeport to a family that maybe is in poverty? They don't have the all the trappings and all the supports.
Right, and that's where the school system has to step in. I mean, I tell people, listen, I'm a lottery winner. I was born in the greatest country in the world. I was born to two healthy adults who had a commitment to each other and stayed healthy. Many of our parents, unfortunately, don't stay healthy. They run into problems, whether it be alcohol or drug abuse. And I'm not saying that's a large percentage, but that's a percentage of the population. Even if they're not running into those problems, if they themselves were not successful students and now they're young parents, they don't have the history of academic achievement and economic success to fall back upon to demonstrate to their children as examples of what they should be pursuing. So it's a cycle. It can be a vicious cycle, but I refuse to believe that the kids of Bridgeport can't excel. I do believe that they can, and obviously we know thousands that have had excellent academic careers in high school and have gone on to do well in college. So,
and you're right, there are organizations like BCYL or Cardinal Sheehan Center or ABCD or whatever organizations that are trying to help our families shore up their shortcomings for the sake of the children.
But it takes more. I mean, society has to realize that it's more difficult to educate a building filled with poor children than it does to educate a building filled with children whose respective families have had the good fortune to now find themselves in a situation where they can provide those students with books at home extracurricular activities, enrichment activities. So if you're running a public school system in the state of Connecticut, you need to know that you've got to put more money into places like Bridgeport and New Haven and Hartford if you want to eliminate the achievement gap and if you want to make these cities great again.
Any final thoughts about making this city a wonderful city that can be a place to cultivate great new talent and great possibility? We've been here a long time, Max, and we're just trying to make it better for our kids. So what's your magic bullet? I know there isn't one, but
there isn't one, but when I see a face like Elias's across the table, that's what we have to hope for, because it is depressing to me that if you picked up a newspaper this week in Bridgeport and read about local political events, some of the names that you would be reading about are the same names that we read about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And some of those folks are fine, but the city needs this next generation to step up and into political power, because they should not sit back and assume, well, this is the best that Bridgeport can do. Well, no, the best that Bridgeport has done in the recent past is not nearly good enough. And I think it's time for a new partnership between the young generation, young blood, and those of us who have been around long enough to know that we need to make big changes.
Moving out of Bridgeport, tell me about Puerto Rico now that you're, well, I don't know what to say about Puerto Rico right now in terms of where it goes from here.
That's a big one. I mean, it's...
I know your heart's still there, right?
Oh, yeah. Heart and family. When the hurricane was approaching, I would ask my mother if she had spoken to her sister, for example, and my mom said yes. And I said, did you tell her to get out of there? Because she's still up in this little house in the hills of Arjuntas. And my mother said yes. She told her sister to get out of there because hurricane was going to come through and it was going to wash the whole house down from up in the hills. And my aunt said, well, if it does, that means I'll have a much shorter trip to get into town. So, that's the Puerto Rican spirit. Whatever comes, we're going to take it on. And when it passes, we're still going to be here. We're still going to be Puerto Rican. We're still going to be proud. We're still going to make it one way or another. And my parents grew up when, my mother would tell her grandkids stories of washing the clothes down by the river, against a washboard or against the rocks. I mean, these are hard-working people. So there was nothing she was going to find in a Bridgeport factory that was tougher than working on the farm. I do worry that, again, the modern illnesses of drug abuse and poverty have sapped too many Puerto Ricans on the island of the spirit that the farmers used to have, and that we've become a dependent society. And I know there are people fighting to change that. It's a gorgeous island with tremendous potential.
Do we leave it to the Puerto Ricans on the island to decide for themselves?
That's the way it should be. But, the American thumb has always been on the scale one way or another. Mm-hmm. So I don't think anybody can be naive about that.
No, that's true.
Hopefully...
but we are part of America.
100%.
Puerto Ricans are Americans.
100% from the moment we're born, much to the shock and dismay of some folks in Washington.
I don't know what else to say. I leave it to you, Elias and or Max, for final words. I'm just so proud to hear of what your family has accomplished, and I want people to know it. And I do this because I hope it inspires others, really, to not think that they have to fit a certain stereotype or in a certain box.
Max, you know what I see a lot among my social circle and even people that are my age is, and I don't follow this because I don't think it's the right thing to believe, and that's that school isn't for everyone, that college isn't for everyone. I hear that so many times. People get their GED, people get their high school diploma equivalency, and they're just like, okay, that's it, I'm done. And then they use that excuse, school isn't for everyone, and they point to the entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, and they say, well, they didn't go to college. But you can't just keep looking at those people like that and say, as your scapegoat, as your excuse, as to why you're not going to college. So what do you say to those people?
Well, I would agree with you, and I would tell you that seems to be the modern equivalent of what sports used to be back in the day. When we were growing up, Frank and I, we would have plenty of classmates who would say, well, I don't have to worry about the books because I'm going to make it to the NBA, or I'm going to make it to the NFL, or back in the days, I'm going to play big league baseball. And sure, a very small percentage achieved those dreams, and they didn't need an academic grounding to succeed. If you can hit the ball 400 feet, you can hit the ball 400 feet. And in today's world, we have people reading about the Zuckerbergs and the Gateses and the other people who drop out and become billionaires, and they say, well, I don't need a degree because I'm going to be the next so-and-so. I've got this great idea for this app. I've got this great idea for this podcast, whatever it may be. And God bless them if they get there. But again, that's a small percentage. That main highway down the middle of the road in America to success always has been, and in my opinion, always will be, running right through the schoolhouse, because that's where you pick up the necessary ingredients to then branch off in any direction you want. I mean, I agree. Not everybody should go to college if you don't want to go to college. There are young people who want to have a career doing something quite different and quite creative, something I can't even understand because I've got an old man's small mind. I still work the old-fashioned remote
or the
control
trades.
Television, whether it be the new economy or an old-fashioned trade like plumbing, or whether it be a career in military service. I would respectfully submit that whichever one of those paths you take, it still makes sense if you can speak and write effectively, if you know something about history, if you can develop critical thinking skills, because those are the types of skills that will help you in any one of those fields. So even if you are not interested in a traditional arc where you do 12 years of schooling and then you do 4 years of college and then you do whatever, that's fine. But those types of skills are always going to be necessary. And if you don't educate yourself, you leave yourself vulnerable to being victimized by others or having too few options in your own life.
I'm going to ask you if there's anything else you want to add.
No, I was going to say, it's sort of like if you don't get the flu shot. You leave yourself vulnerable.
That's a good idea.
And Max, I have images of you flipping burgers at our opening day ceremony, which I'm sure you'll be at again.
Looking forward to it.
I thank you for all your service. I thank you for what you've done in our community. And you still live here, don't you?
Absolutely. My home is in Bridgeport. My law firm is in Bridgeport. I'm a Bridgeporter, and I do believe that Bridgeport, especially in the near term, we have a newly elected governor who has a real affection for Bridgeport, and I believe that he's going to try and pursue policies that will inure to the benefit of Bridgeporters. So we've got our fingers crossed. You never succeed by walking around pessimistically. So we've got to fight. We can never give up.
Aside from politics, what are some other fields that you see the younger generation getting into or maybe that they should be getting into aside from politics?
I would love to see more of our kids become Bridgeport teachers. I know a few. I mean, again, since I'm still a Bridgeporter, I'll walk into CVS and I'll bump into a young man who was in school with my son, and he's completing his 10th year teaching music at Reed School. That makes a huge impact when kids can learn from young adults who just a few years earlier were sitting in those classrooms themselves as Bridgeport students. So I hope that more of our young people will take up education as a profession. It pays well, has a pension at the end of the road, and you can really change lives. So always, the law is a tough profession. It's a tough way to make a living in today's world. But again, I would urge young people who are interested in it to pursue it. I also think that too many people in poor communities don't get grounding in economic literacy and don't think about joining the corporate world. And, you know, that's an avenue that should be explored. Corporations in America will be better off if they start populating their ranks with people who have had various experiences and backgrounds. So I would love to see more Bridgeport kids getting corporate internships, digging in, and working their way up that corporate ladder.